Hello, and welcome to A Rebel Without a Clause. No, welcome to Naval History Live, and a long patrol on the British Act, the British Naval Defence Act of 1889. Now, this is part 1 of 4, so it's 1 of 4. And before I get into it, I'm going to start off by saying, this is coming out during the between Christmas but not yet New Year period of 2020. And I want to say thank you to all those people who subscribe to me. Thank you to all those people who just watch the videos. Don't even subscribe, just watch. You're all more than appreciated. All the people who comment and chat during the lives, you make it wonderful. It is kind of like a lecturing experience in that usually about a third of the class will ask questions and chat away, and about 2/3 of the class you hope are engaged because they're sitting there, they're listening, and as long as you can't see their telephones, you hope they're paying attention. And thank you to everyone who's on Discord chatting away there. Thank you to everyone who's also listens to Bilge Pumps, and thank you most of all to the people who are my patrons and who do the super chats. Being an early career researcher and a contract lecturer is not a career choice I would advise anyone to make. If you're really passionate about the topic and it's what you want to do, you can sort of survive, but it isn't it's a long time to get from the PhD, most of the time, to the actual paying tenure track role. And it's a lot of uncertainty during it. And I have to say, it has shocked me that in many ways, the very kind people on Patreon and Super Chat have, despite all the uncertainty of this year, actually managed to enable me to keep up my research, to keep buying the books and buying the things I need to do the research when I can't go to the archives. So thank you very much for your kind sponsorship and your kind support. Anyway, getting into the actual meat and content of this video. Now, the Naval Defence Act of 1889 is one of those wondrous things in that it happens and apparently makes law what had already been in existence, the two-power standard. Now, before we get into this, we have to explain a little bit about the two-power standard, because two-power standard is always taken as being the Royal Navy has to have the strength of the next two navies combined. Now, that is true, the next two navies combined. But there are caveats to it. It can be more, you can require more than that in cruisers, and in almost that in battleships. It's one of those interesting things. Often when you start talking about it, people immediately focus in on the battleships. They focus in on the battleships because the battleships are these sexy things which have these huge, massive guns and look glorious, are the centerpieces of anyone's battle fighting strategy, and therefore they must be the center of your naval strategy. But that's kind of like going up to a modern army and going, yes, those main battle tanks there, they are the most important part of you. When actually, in fact, most armies, if you're talking about firepower, you're going to talk about their artillery. If you're going to talk about information gathering and the ability to use that artillery, you're talking about the reconnaissance units and quite a lot of urban warfare, which is quite a lot of modern warfare. You'd be talking about infantry. So tanks are useful, but often they are actually supporting other units, and that's how they're useful. There are a few scenarios where tanks do take a lead, and then they are really incredibly important there, but other times they are the supporting assets. And that there's nothing wrong with that. There is sometimes this weird idea that there is something wrong with being a supporting asset. No, it still matters to be a supporting asset. And it's the same with battleships. They are many times in certain sections and certain scenarios, they are the critical tool. They are the absolute thing you must have. But in others, they are not. In others, they are the supporting assets. They might not even be the present assets. They might be the distantly they exist assets. So, do you really want to mess with little old me, the sloop, or maybe the cruiser assets, which you can see because over that horizon somewhere there is a whole posse of Armageddon waiting for you. That's battleships. And I'm saying all this, and I know that this first part of this series of these videos on the Naval Defense Act of 1889 is going to focus on battleships. Because if I don't, I will get asked about them in the comments, and I will never be able to do as good a reply in the comments as I could do here. So, the context. And also, it's important to remember that the battleships give people the excuse to do the rest. So, the context. Whenever we hear about the 1889 law, we start talking about France and Russia, and everyone's looking at that. Well, actually, Germany is also a very big part of it. Yes, their law doesn't come in till 9 years later. And yes, they are talking about vessels in commission and vessels in reserve. That is quite a common thing for this period. Okay, it's very common to have quite a large chunk of your fleet in reserve. Believe it or not, the Cold War is kind of abnormal in the way it sees reserve forces treated, because the whole idea that we're going to end up at nuclear war within 45 minutes or even a day or two starts to erode the whole idea of having a military reserve. And this is why we're in half the trouble we're in these days. Because imagine it if America had some reserve aircraft carriers. So when they need to do a surge, instead of mucking about with the timetabling and the maintenance schedule of their commission ships, their in-service ones, they go along and go, right, then we're activating one of the reserve ships and we're activating some reservists and see if they want to come. We'll put a call out to reserves and go, anyone want to volunteer for this? Usually there are enough reservists who either want to get away from home for some reason or are currently unemployed, or would be far more pay for doing what they do on a ship, then they'll quite happily sign up, go up for a year and go up. That is how they used to do things for over 100 years. Okay, it worked very well. Yes, we talk about but modern systems, they are far more complicated. In some of the periods we're talking about, the level of literacy was very, very low, and they still managed to make it work with what is very complicated systems these days. These days, most people have quite a high level of computer literacy. Yes, there are some parts of a ship which, frankly, I would want regulars to be manning, but that could be a far smaller kernel of a crew, especially if that carrier is perhaps non-nuclear. But we'll leave that to one side. So, you have regular ships and reserve. And that is for the whole force to be able to. And this is very important. This is the first naval law. But this isn't coming from nowhere. Germany isn't just suddenly producing these things. They aren't suddenly going, we need large cruisers, we need light cruisers, we need this, we need that. They aren't suddenly producing this in 1898. They have been doing this for a while. And Tirpitz has not come from nowhere. The German Navy has slowly been building up. They talk about their place in the sun. They talk about various things with different Kaisers and they see themselves as the coming power. They see themselves as status. And you also have to imagine that they are a coming industrial power. In many ways, Britain sees more of itself in Germany than it does in France because of Germany's level of industrialization, Germany's level of focus in terms of its production, whereas the French production we'll be getting into is beautiful but spread out and looks like hotels. The German production is far more focused. So, here's the thing, though. In 1889, Germany's talking about building their first ever battleships. And they're going to build a class of 4. Now, I'm not sure what's happened to the slide there, but cut off the bit. The Brandenburg class, and you can see a nice little sort of pretty diagram of them. The thing is, most battleships had 4 main guns and lots of little secondary guns. These had 6 in 3 centerline batteries. And I know what you're saying. Isn't that a groovy gun to have it mounted below a sort of bridge structure in the center of the ship, you know? Isn't it cool? Yeah, sorry, no. But the thing is, Germany builds 4 of these in 4 years. They build 4 of them in 4 years. That is a major statement of capability. And then they start building another class, and then they start building another class, and then they start building another class. And the thing is, they have been working like up to this for a while before then. They have been building ironclads, coastal defense ships, all sorts of things before this point. Yes, for some reason, they're using the French Navy as inspiration for some of their designs. And we can all be certain that whoever was doing that must have been drinking some very, very strong wine. But they are good ships. And they are building them in classes. They are building them as size. And these are ships which are armed with, let's see, 4 28 centimeter, that 280 millimeter, that's 11 inch Mark L40 guns, 40 caliber. So quite a long barrels. And 2, surprise, surprise, one of the turrets, and I'll let you guess which one, has 35 L35s. Again, 11 inch guns though, 280 millimeters. They have 6 105 millimeter guns, quick firing guns, and 8 88 millimeter guns. The Germans do have an affinity for the 88 millimeter. And 6 18 inch or 450 millimeter torpedoes. Free barbette. And the barbettes are particularly interesting. It is a wonderfully powerful statement of intent and capability. And to think Britain has to think about this. Britain has to consider this when they're starting to look around the world. Then we now have the French. Marceau is an ironclad, which is a pre-Dreadnought. One of their class was started production in 1883 and didn't finish till 1890. Do not take this the wrong way. But look who just came for a quick visit. The trainee assistant, fluffy research assistant. Pure academic styling going on there, you know. True career path. Do you want to stay around and discuss French pre-dreadnoughts, or do you want to run away? You want to run. I understand you. As you see, they're fun ships. They are really fun ships. And I can't see at all where the French pre-dreadnought, Jacques comes from. There is no similarity between those at all. difference between an ironclad and a pre-dreadnought is, honestly, sometimes it just seems to be about years, but there are subtle differences in hull design, armoring, engines, and weaponry tend to be used. So, Jacquerie is, of course, the French response to the British laying down these lovely things. And to be honest, you have the Brennus, you have the Charles Martel, you have the Carnot, you have the Jacquerie, and all of them have a similar of two 305mm guns and two 274mm guns, with the 305s mounted like that and the 274s mounted like that. And they all have different speeds, different armor, sort of stylings. They have different weights. Honestly, the French do not start producing ships as a class until you get to the Charlemagne class, which are laid down in 1894, and they build 3 of them. And that's also the first class which have 4 305mm guns, which suddenly is going to make life a lot easier. But here's the point. Laid down in 1894, they're still following the same pattern. This is laid down in 1890. Which do I worry about more? We're talking about broadside engagements. This has 3 guns which can engage on any broadside. This has 6. Yes. 305mm and a 270mm. 274. Technically, they're the bigger guns, and technically the Charlemagne with 305mm is still the bigger guns. But they're all following this same pattern. I'm non-pulsed, would be the exact expression, because they are designed in a way that is going to make fire control problematic. They have a whole sorts of problems of forming an actual decent squadron out of them, because they have differing operating speeds, different sort of acceleration rates, different, very, very different engines. Yes, they are a threat, and yes, they are building numbers, and yes, they build a lot more. And this is one of the problems which we will get into with the law, in that very quickly, French and Russian production outpaces that prospected, so the British have to build even more. But the fact is, this French production is quite often production on paper, because you've got the ships separated often by this thing called Spain, because you have one fleet in the Mediterranean and one in the Atlantic. And more than all of that, they are not coherent. They're not producing a coherent squadron. Again, we go back to it. If any nation could, at this time, with the pace of the building and what they're going, have justified building one-offs, Germany could, as it's developing its skills, as it's developing itself up to build the proper ships. But it doesn't. It launches straight into a class of 4. The next class is another class of 4. They're building coherent squadrons. They're building a tactically capable force, an operationally capable force. The French are building a load of experiments. Beautiful in many, many ways, but experiments. Then we have the Russians. Now, honestly, Devastad Absolov laid down 1889, commissioned 1893. Well, that's actually built in a fairly decent time. Commissioned, that's quite good timings for that. But again, the Russians are building one-offs. And yes, I do actually have to say I do prefer some of the Russian ships. But we'll leave that to one side. One of the first things you notice about the Russian ships is, again, they have double barbettes and double turrets. And barbettes to turrets is one of the things which sort of separates, theoretically, some pre-dreadnoughts from pre-dreadnoughts from ironclads, but we'll leave that to one side, as that doesn't hold true for all of them. This is, of course, built in 1889, and she's a fine-looking ship. Doesn't have exactly the most happy career, but it's a fine-looking ship. And the Russians are going on building, but again, they are building one-offs. Eventually, they get to the Petroblask class, who are all laid down in 1892. So, again, another nation which actually decides to start building in classes before the French. Even when the French do build in classes, they have problems. The French Navy in this period is a study of this looks great on paper. Would you actually like to try and command this fleet? Well, in your simulations, did you base all the ships off what they were supposed to do or off what they actually could do? Did you treat every ship as an individual class? Because basically they were. Starts to get once you start trying to operate a French fleet together, that's interesting. And it's the same again with the 2-power standard, because that's presuming and assuming an allied force would actually manage to operate their combined force of battleships together as one fleet. The Royal Navy doesn't have a particular battle in mind when it starts thinking about allies operating a fleet together facing it, and all the issues that can come about. Of course it doesn't. But there is also the rest of the world. There is the American Great White Fleet, which this, of course, takes place later, and America takes up building, and this fleet is actually going around the world when Dreadnought's in service. So that's 16 years later. But it starts back in the 1890s. The British are reading the tea leaves. They are seeing what is being built. They are seeing what is coming. And these ships are capable. And the thing is, they need to start building up a capable navy as well. They do have a capable navy, but they have been doing a lot of experimenting, a lot of building other ships for other nations, and a few ships for themselves, but now they need to really work on strengthening their forces. And you have to remember, these ships themselves aren't being built in isolations. There are British ships which they are being built and compared to when they're being built. The French are comparing themselves with the Italians, when Italy is formed, of course, with the Germans when they start building battleships, with the Spanish, the South Americans, who are mostly commissioning ships from other people, with various Asian powers and what they're building. Of course, again, you have Japan. Battle of Tsushima is a while away now, but again, Japan is starting that work as we talk. They have had a wake-up call. They had the black ships of Commodore Perry's squadron visit them. They've had that experience. They've had that affront. They've had that damage to their national psyche, and they are working hard to overcome it. Now, admittedly, their first battleship will be a captured Chinese one, but we'll leave that to one side. There are lots of powers in the world building ships. And Britain's got to think about it. And they've got to build their own ships. Are they building all their ships for fighting a massive war? Well, we'll see. We'll talk about that in the next part. But they are certainly not just considering the French and the Russians, despite all the talk about them being the second and third naval powers in the world at this time. They were. It's true. But there were other nations which they also needed to take notice of. Because here was the problem if you're the Royal Navy. You need to have a squadron to protect the UK. And you probably need a reserve squadron to be activated in time of war, because you can't afford to run enough ships in peace. But you can't afford to not have enough ships for war either. You probably need a squadron in the Mediterranean. You always need a squadron in the Mediterranean because that's your supply route to India and to your colonies in the Far East. And if you want to go around Africa, that adds literally months onto the voyage time. So you prefer to go through the Mediterranean Suez Canal. You probably need a presence in the Caribbean. Again, you have a lot of holdings you have to protect there. And you have a rising local power, which is always teetering on having a decent navy. So you have Russia and France to deal with. And then you have other powers, because the trouble with being the best, with being the first amongst equals, with being the biggest empire, the biggest navy, is you always have to be the best. You always have to be the biggest. You always have to be the first, because if you aren't, that means you no longer are. And if you no longer are, your position is going to be taken. And when your position is taken, you're going to lose everything, because everything is dependent upon you maintaining that position. If we consider now, that's currently, I would say, not what America's necessarily facing in terms of the reality, because I would draw more similarities between China and pre-World War One and pre-World War One Germany in terms of approach, maybe even pre-World War Two, but considering some of the things going on, but we'll go with pre-World War One Germany, in that they're a land power which has got a humongous land border, and they're used to sea as mainly as a defense in terms of, like the Russian system, of bastions, of protecting their defense in depth. In that, for them, sea power is optional. To get most of the places they want to go, they can go by land. Whereas for America, to get most of the places it wants to go, it has to go by sea or by air or space. And air and space both come with heavy cargo limitations. Although it could be quite cool. So America is very much in the British position now. The Naval Defense Act of 2021, anyone? Anyway, leaving that to one side, I hope you've enjoyed part one. As said, there will be 4 parts. And thank you again to everyone who's been watching. The Great White Fleet was really cool. This is one of the things I do want to send. There's a reason I use this picture, because it's about America going out around the world and saying, we're here, we've arrived. And there is something in this picture to really think for in the future, because watch, the reason the Russians like to send the Kuznetsov around the world is to say, we're here, we're relevant, we're capable, no matter how many tugboats the Kuznetsov needs. Remember, this went round the world with the support of British colliers. Watch for what other nations might do soon with their principal assets. They might go on a nice global voyage or an exercise in the North Atlantic when they come from the Pacific. Something to show they're here and they're now a power on the global stage. It will come. Take care, and see you in part 2.